Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Another cold day here in Maine, so I figured that I would chronicle my installation of my Emax Servo. I've got that right here. This is the analog version of the servo because I didn't feel like spending extra money on the digital version. I also have the Hot Racing aluminum servo mount, and the reason that I went with this is just because it's a cleaner fit overall, although you can use the stock one. And this, of course, is all going on my modded SCX24 C10 that I have here. So I'm going to chronicle exactly what I did to install, hopefully give you guys a couple of helpful tips and tricks, and then we can see how it performs. I also have a little announcement at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so let's get started with what we need in order to do this. Well, first and foremost, we obviously need the truck because that's what the servo is going to go in. Secondly, you need the servo itself. Now, there's a couple of differences here. You can tell whether or not you bought an analog or digital by the second letter here. ES08M, A for analog, D for digital. The digital is a little more precise, a little bit faster, but it uses more battery life. To me, the difference was not worth the money, and anything that I could do to prolong battery life in these trucks is worth it to me. You can use the stock mount, but I bought the Hot Racing aluminum mount. It really wasn't that expensive. I think it was only around 10 bucks. And it's just a cleaner fit overall, so I prefer that. But again, you could totally get away with using the stock mounts. As far as tools you need, you're going to need something that has a 4mm hex so that you can take the front wheels off, because those are going to come off the truck. You need the Allen key that comes with the truck, or a .050 Allen key. I bought this one, again, forever ago, but it holds up very nicely. You need a small screwdriver for the servo horn. Let me show you what I'm using here. This is just from a small kit of screwdrivers I had, small Phillips head, and I think that this will work. And if for some reason it doesn't, I've got a couple others that I can try. And we will need to snip part of the Emax servo. And in order to do that and also clean up the servo horn a little bit, you're going to need like wire cutters or something. I wish that I had a better set of wire cutters here, but I'm going to just use this. That should be able to cut the plastic. And again, I know that this is not really the appropriate tool for the job, but unfortunately I live in a tiny apartment and have to make do with what I have. So let's jump into what exactly I'm going to do here, and I will show you step by step how I'm going to approach this. Okay, first and foremost, we're going to remove the body. I don't think you need to take the body all the way off. Some people do. That's up to you. Personally, I'm going to just leave it like that because most of what we're doing is in the front of the truck anyways, and since the body flips up to the back, it shouldn't make a huge difference. First thing you want to note here is that the servo goes in with the yellow wire on top, and it plugs into this little steering spot on the ESC receiver combo. So that's where our new servo is going to go, and from here on out it should be a pretty simple install, but I always want to let people know that that's how it goes in case for some reason you plug it in and think that you got a bad servo or something. Just double check that the wires are oriented correctly. Next step here is going to be to take off the wheels. I'm going to actually straighten them out beforehand, but I'm going to show you a little trick to make sure that your servo is lined up properly when we get to that part of the install video. For anybody wondering, because I get a lot of questions, these are Proline Hyrax tires, and I've got 3.5 gram brass hexes underneath there. I'm going to take all of this out just because these little spindles that go in the hexes themselves tend to fall out, and notice all of the hair and stuff that's gotten clogged up in here. It's nice to clean all that out a little bit. Okay, and that's done. So we can set this aside, set your wheels aside. Won't need those for a little while now. So the next step in all this is going to be to drop the front axle so you can actually access the servo. We're going to remove these two top bolts on either shock, and that is going to drop the front axle down so that we can take the servo out as needed. I've spoken before about how sometimes these screws can strip out easily. I've only taken the front shocks off once, and this screw is already a little stripped from the stock tool, so I recommend getting something a little more high quality. So when you pull this down, your drive shaft might disconnect. That's no big deal, and don't worry about it. So there we go. Our servo is now disconnected. Totally done. Don't need to worry about that anymore. What we're going to do next is we're going to unclip this part of the steering linkage here so that when we take the servo out, the servo saver and horn comes with it, and so does this little piece of the linkage. And this is important because you can't otherwise get a screwdriver back to screw in the servo horn on the Emax Servo. Okay, so now we've got our steering link disassembled here, and personally, I don't think at this scale and at this speed especially, you need a servo saver, so I am not going to reuse this in any way, shape, or form. I'm just going to use the servo horn that comes with the Emax Servo. So there's a couple of bolts that we need to take out, 2 more to get the servo out itself. It's these 2 right here, and that will actually allow you to take the entire servo off. So I'm going to take those off, and then we can remove the servo. Okay, so once you remove these bolts, the servo is going to fall out, I guess. So if you're reusing the stock mount for the Emax Servo, which again you can do, I'm just choosing not to, there's a couple of things that I want to address here. One, the Emax Servo really is not that much bigger than the stock servo. The only thing that you have to watch here is the sides of the Emax Servo, these in particular, and it's going to get mounted with the sticker facing down so that's the same orientation as the stock servo was. Take a look, when you compare them side by side like this, it really isn't that much wider. In fact, it's almost exactly the same. It's a little bit longer though, and that's of course because it's a little more substantial. I'm going to move this so I don't lose that. But it does fit fairly snugly in the stock servo mount. Take a look at this. See, it's tough. You got to really force it in there, but you can force it and it stays. However, I don't think this is the cleanest way to do it. Some people have also mentioned that you can cut the back parts of the stock servo mount and that will help it fit a little more flush. I don't really want to do that, which is why I bought the Hot Racing aluminum mount. In order to take the servo mount off, we're going to remove these 2 bolts here, and there's one more bolt back here that's hidden right there. And that, of course, connects to these links right here, and overall is pretty important to the functioning of this truck. And it needs to be snug but not too tight because you need to be able to keep this up and down motion so that you can get articulation when you're actually driving. So let's remove these bolts. Okay, so I've removed the bolts from the stock servo mount, and this should lift right up out. I kept this bolt in the back, so that long bolt is going to be what threads back through these links right here. And the reason I did that was just so I wouldn't get it mixed up with the front 2 bolts that actually also help hold in the front diff cover. And I do plan on changing this out to brass at some point, but unfortunately when I went to the hobby shop to pick up some parts, they were all sold out. So here's the Hot Racing aluminum mount, and this is just going to go back in the same way we just took the old one out. And obviously we need to get this back in the truck before we can actually mount the servo itself. So I'm going to start by threading in the front 2 screws and then finish off with the one in the back. You don't need to worry about reconnecting your drive shaft here. We will do that later on. That doesn't happen until we put the shocks back on to the chassis itself. That's how the servo mount's going to fit. Fits very nicely. It might be a tad bit heavier than the plastic one, but in reality, I don't think weight makes a huge difference, and I totally understand why people would just reuse the stock mount. But again, I think that this looks just a little bit cleaner, and I do plan on eventually upgrading to the Hot Racing aluminum steering links. So in the meantime, this seems like a good little and inexpensive part to add just a little more bling to the crawler. And again, you just want to make sure that these screws are snug but not too tight because you need a little bit of room in there so that the differential can breathe, and especially that bearing on the top part of the diff cover itself. I apologize for having the Emax Servo just hanging out in the background there too. I know it's a little distracting, but I wanted to just keep it out and within my reach because pretty soon we're going to be putting that in the truck. So that's pretty snug right there. Now this is where I am interested to see how tight the fit is. So the link itself fits pretty nicely. The clearance in there is just about perfect. I've heard of a couple people saying that they need to add Loctite to the aluminum here in order to keep the screw tight. I don't know if I'm going to do that. And the reason being is that, one, this truck obviously operates at pretty low speed. Should it ever vibrate loose or anything like that, I won't have to worry too much about anything going missing or getting broken. And two, you know, it's tough to get leverage sometimes with such a small thread on the screw, such a small head on the screw. And so I would personally rather try to avoid putting a locking agent in here like Loctite. But I can understand why some people would want to have that extra bit of security. To me, the threading feels pretty good, and it feels like the screw's going to be fairly tight once it's in. And again, we just want to go snug, but not too tight with this. Most of this I'm doing with my fingers. Okay, we'll tighten that down. It moves as it should. I'm going to give it just a little bit more. Want to make sure nothing's binding, of course. But there we go. There's some play in there. We're not binding. And we'll just triple check that once the servo is actually in. If we have to tighten or loosen that, I think you can do it pretty easily without taking the rest of the truck apart. So now it's time for the servo itself. The servo is going to mount just like this. Sticker down in the servo output here on the right-hand side. And the reason we need to trim a little bit is so that it fits between these frame rails. It seems that even without trimming, it's going to fit just fine. I mean, it's a little close. I don't have any rub, but I think that, you know, it's better to be on the safe side and just trim the top part of these ears right here. And that is so that when your axle is twisting, you actually will keep the clearance and not hit up against the frame rails. So again, pretty easy to trim here. A lot of this is just cheap plastic. And all you need is something that will cut through that, which is why I'm going to use the wire cutters. Okay, so I've cut here and here. Pro tip, you can always cut extra if you have to. This right side, or this left side here, there's not quite a lot of material left, but I think it'll hold just fine, especially once it's screwed in. I left a little bit more on the right side. And I actually used the Lexan scissors that I used to cut my body to just clean these cuts up a little bit. But that should give it plenty of clearance, and therefore, when you have to worry about articulation, things like that, you'll be just fine. So in order to reinstall this, it's pretty straightforward. You've got two screws, one on either side, and that's going to screw right into the mount itself. So next up is we got to get the steering link mounted to the steering servo horn before we actually install it. Trust me, this is the easiest way to do it because it's going to be tough to get a screwdriver back there and install what you need when it's actually on the truck. And I am not reusing the stock servo saver. I just don't think you need it at a scale like this and at these speeds. If you're building your SCX24 to be some sort of brushless monster truck, more power to you, but personally, I don't think you need that. So every Emax servo is going to come with a little bag of goodies here. You have two options for which servo horn you use. You can use this 4-horn one and just cut 3 of them off and use the remainder, which is likely what I'm going to do just because I think it's a cleaner shape than trying to cut the extra 3rd hole off of this arm. But all of these are designed for the Emax and will fit right on. Notice there's splines in here, and that's going to line right up with the splines on the servo itself. But before we do any of that, let's cut this one down to size because this is the one I would like to use, and then we can screw the steering link back in, and we will get this mounted onto the truck. Okay, so here's the steering horn. This is what we're going to attach the linkage to. These are the same length, so it doesn't make much of a difference. And you're going to attach it to the bottom hole here. So just screw that in, tighten it down, and then we can attach this to the servo itself. Getting the thread started on the servo horn is a bit difficult, but with some persistence it'll go just fine. So remember, the splines that actually go into the servo are going to be on the opposite side of where your screw comes out from, which is on the opposite side of where your steering link is. So this is how it's going to look when it gets installed back on the truck. Now this screw is fairly long. I'm going to snip this down a bit just because I don't really have any plans to ever change this out again. And I think that this could cause some issues and get hung up on some things. It's a bit shorter now, and I may actually take tin snips to it and cut it again, but that's certainly an improvement over where it was. Now, I always like to plug the servo in, make sure that the trim is set perfectly straight, and then go from there, and you can always adjust after. But the reason that I do that is to make sure that the servo itself from the factory has been straightened, nobody's tried to turn it or anything like that, and this is just a good way to triple check that everything is good there. Okay, so my trim is perfectly straight now, so theoretically, when this is straight, and putting the servo horn on straight means that I won't have to mess with the trim much at all once I actually put the wheels back on the truck. So our next step here is to actually install our servo horn that we got from the box. It's very simple. Fits on just like that, and then we'll screw our steering link back in after. There's a screw that goes right in the center hole there, and that's where the Phillips head screwdriver comes into play. So the screw that you're going to use for this is the short black one that comes with the Emax Servo. The longer silver one would be used for the horns itself. But we don't need that attachment since we reused our stock servo connector for the steering linkage. Okay, so here's our steering servo horn being installed, and this is another screw that you want to make nice and snug, but not too tight. If it's too tight, there could be some binding. We're going to reinstall our steering link here. It goes in the top hole of the two. Okay, the truck is finally starting to take shape yet again. Next thing, and this is very important, make sure you reconnect your front drive shaft, which is a bit difficult to do. The easiest way that I've found to do it is first move that servo horn wire out of the way, which is very long, by the way. And then you can reconnect the drive shaft underneath. And when you actually push back up to put the shocks back on, you'll notice that the drive shaft will stay in place. Easiest way to keep it in place too is to just keep a finger down there and hold it in place. Remember, your shocks compress. We have to compress them a little bit to keep that upward pressure on it. Not an issue. So here we have it. The servo's installed. All that's left to do is put the wheels and tires back on. Notice we've got plenty of articulation, and we're not going to bind even if we have to do some intense crawling. The other thing I would recommend is actually getting a little zip tie for this, although I may do the relocation of the ESC receiver to the back half of the chassis and move the battery up front anyways. So I'm going to leave the length on this for now, but you could always trim these wires down or just coil them nicely and put a zip tie there to hold them all in place. Remember, that goes into your first channel on your ESC receiver, your steering channel, and voila. So let's get the wheels and tires back on. I'll show you a video of this servo in action, and then we'll wrap the video up. And there you have it. The Emax Servo is installed. And again, I know the wiring's a little bit ugly, but I'm going to just leave that be for now until I get a zip tie to zip tie that down, or if I decide to do the battery relocation ESC swap to get this moved up to the front, that extra wiring will come in handy. Next up, running video. The last thing that I want to mention here is that I went in and changed the endpoints on the steering servo with this dial right here. If you're on the first generation, it's called D/R. And I dialed that back because from the factory it was dialed all the way up. Now listen closely. That changes the endpoints of the servo itself. And that buzzing noise that you hear is the servo trying to turn the wheels more than they can actually turn. So by dialing that back a little bit, you don't lose any mobility, but theoretically it will help to prolong the life of the servo. Well, that was fun. Hopefully now I will be able to perform a little bit better out on the trails. Something I've noticed is that now that I've upgraded to the Proline Hyrax tires, which have more grip, my stock servo sometimes struggles to actually turn the wheels, especially on grippy surfaces like rock. So hopefully this will remedy that problem. And the best way, of course, to compare is, well, what's it like stock out of the box? That's right, I picked up another one, another C10 too, so we can do a side-by-side comparison. Hopefully, as spring gets a little bit warmer, again here in Maine, winter still goes through like May 15th, at least that's how I always tell people. We can do a bit of a comparison between these two trucks, and you can see how the mods to my C10 have helped, or maybe really don't make that big of a difference over what it's like stock out of the box. So thanks everybody for watching. If you could hit that subscribe button, that would be awesome. Leave a like, leave a comment, whatever. And if you enjoy this series and want to see more side-by-side comparisons, especially between a stock out of the box C10 and my modded C10, make sure you let me know. Till then, have a great day, everyone.